Ecological Succession in Point Pleasant Park, analyzing species richness, diversity, and dominance after Hurricane Juan.
Okay, so this is our project on succession in Point Pleasant Park, or PPP. Point Pleasant Park is located in Halifax, Nova Scotia. This park covers about 75 acres and is mostly forested, with a nice network of roads and trails to explore. Point Pleasant Park has a rich history, especially for the Mi'kmaq people, who call it Mtukati, which means spiritual place. It's been an important gathering spot for them and highlights the park's cultural significance. Looking at Point Pleasant Park's ecological history, we see big changes, especially after European colonization began in 1749, which led to the removal of a lot of the original forest. Before Hurricane Juan hit in 2003, the park was home to long-lived tree species, typical of the Acadian forest. But because of its even-aged structure, it was pretty vulnerable. After the hurricane, over 70% of tree canopy was lost, making recovery tough. The park's isolation from seed sources and the historical clearing of woody debris may have also hurt soil quality. So, in this presentation, we will focus on species richness, Shannon diversity, and dominant species over time since the hurricane to address how succession has unfolded in the park. Our main goal is to assess ecological succession in Point Pleasant Park following Hurricane Juan. Specifically, we'll investigate how species richness, diversity, and dominance have changed over time using data collected annually since 2004. We hypothesize that Point Pleasant Park will see an increase in both species richness and diversity as time progresses, and then ultimately stabilizing due to ecological succession. In this process, we expect that early successional species will initially dominate the landscape, but then over time they will gradually be replaced by late successional species that are better adapted to a mature ecosystem.
Methods: in situ data collection. 6 study sites within Point Pleasant Park were selected based on their positioning within zones of the highest hurricane impacts on forest composition. Trees: the diameter at breast height or DBH and species of all live trees within each study site with a DBH of 2.5 centimeters or greater were measured and recorded. DBH is measured at 4.5 feet from the ground. Ground flora: within each study site, a 1 square meter wooden quadrat frame was randomly placed 12 times. The randomization strategy was for one group member to stand at the edge of the study site facing away and throw a brightly colored object over their shoulder. The object location became the center of the quadrat. All species within each quadrat were identified and their percent cover estimated. The final percent cover was based on consensus among group members. Analytical methods: a simple linear regression analysis was chosen for this study as it is used to quantify a potential relationship between one or more independent variables and one or more dependent variables. The scatter plot for each set of variables exhibited some degree of linear relationship, meaning a regression analysis is appropriate. Because our goal is to answer specific questions by quantifying a potential relationship between variables, it is beneficial to obtain an equation that describes the relationship and diagnostics, such as a p-value, to indicate the strength. Note, all data used in this study were obtained since 2004 using the same study sites and methods, with the exception of the following years: 2005, 2007, 2016, and 2020.
To evaluate this question, the Shannon Diversity Index graph is analyzed in order to assess the overall diversity, abundance, and evenness levels before and after Hurricane Juan, spanning from 2003 to 2024. As evidenced by the graph, it appears that overall, the diversity of a large variety of species found within Point Pleasant Park greatly increased after Hurricane Juan in 2003. Interestingly, however, the hurricanes which followed in the subsequent years did not have as much as a detrimental effect on the populations in the park as much as Hurricane Juan did. From the year 2010 onwards, the majority of the Shannon Diversity Index values appear between the 1.5 and higher range, indicating, as previously mentioned, a higher rate of diversity throughout the park. After further analysis, after the effects of COVID-19 in 2020, the overall diversity has diminished only slightly. Although most of the populations still depict a high diversity index, the values appear most often in the 1 to 1.5 range, demonstrating a lower rate of diversity than in previous years. On top of the high diversity observed, there's an interesting trend observed within the graph pertaining to low diversity. From 2003 to 2009, there's a particular species or group of species who rank as a 0 with the Shannon Diversity Index, indicating that these populations were not present throughout these years. However, the trend ends in 2009, meaning that a new population was introduced somewhere between 2009 and 2010. This fact indicates that the forest is able to rebuild and sustain itself to such a degree that new species are able to be introduced and thrive even after a devastating natural disaster. This general increase in diversity can be explained by adaptations species had adopted following the initial hurricane in 2003. Although Hurricane Juan wiped out around 70% of the nature within the park, the natural devastation taught trees how to sustain high winds and access water in the soil, animal populations how to maintain their habitats and change reproductive habits in order to sustain their populations, just to name a few examples. Since the Shannon Diversity Index has generally begun to steadily increase, even after the 2020 COVID-19 dip in diversity, the adaptations that have been made by the various species in the park proves that there's some reliability that these current populations will continue to diversify as time moves on, even if there are more natural devastations in the future, like hurricanes and global pandemics. Hopefully, in the near future, the diversity increases once again in order to reach complete stability and balance.
Results: dominant tree species density. Pre-Hurricane Juan, from at least 1985 until 2004, the dominant tree species was red spruce. By 2009, the dominant tree species was red maple. Regression analysis suggests that there is a significant positive weak relationship between both red maple density and red spruce density and time. The relationships are weak as only 16% and 12% of the variation between the respective species and time was accounted for in the model. Despite such a small amount of variability being accounted for, we could still consider this relatively useful, being that the data was collected in situ and that we do see a trend of increasing density for both tree species over time. Thus, our model would suggest that red maple density increases by approximately 2.56 trees per 400 square meters per year, and red spruce density by 0.34 trees per 400 square meters per year. Further, red spruce has over double the lifespan at 250 to 350 years of red maple at 80 to 130 years, as well as a taller mature height 21 to 24 meters compared to 8 to 22 meters. This could suggest slower growing times, but notably longer persistence of red spruce. This is supported by Keyes, who suggests that while, as of 2019, 74% of the forest community in Point Pleasant Park is in an early successional state, characterized by a domination of red maple and white birch, there is a notable amount of red spruce and white pine cropping up, which Keyes says is likely to move towards a climax community dominated by red spruce and hemlock.
This part of the study aimed to explore how species richness has changed over time in the park. To approach this question, data was collected annually on species richness from 2004 onward, with the exception of 2005, 2007, and 2016 due to hurricanes, and then again 2020 due to the pandemic. This study focuses on analyzing the changes in the number of species and observing the patterns of early successional and late successional species over time, evaluating fluctuations and overall trends in species richness. You can find the data for changes in species richness in Figure 3. The results indicate that species richness has fluctuated significantly with an overall upward trend. In 2004, the highest recorded richness was only 4 species. Since then, species richness has gradually increased, peaking at 14 in 2017. From 2004 to 2010, the study observed lower richness, while a notable increase occurred between 2011 and 2015. And then in the more recent years, from 2016 to 2024, the results showed stabilization of around 10 to 12 species. This suggests that the ecosystem is reaching maturity. In conclusion, the study indicates that species richness in Point Pleasant Park is indeed decreasing over time and stabilizing as the ecosystem matures. This supports our hypothesis that Point Pleasant Park will increase in species richness and diversity over time and then stabilize due to ecological succession. Over time, species richness in Point Pleasant Park has shown a significant upward trend, increasing from a low of 4 species in 2004 due to Hurricane Juan to a peak of 14 species in 2017. In the early years from 2004 to 2010, richness was lower as the forest underwent initial ecological succession. The notable increases from 2011 to 2015 reflect the maturation of the forest, and in more recent years, 2016 to 2024, richness values have stabilized at around 10 to 12, indicating that the forest is entering a more stable phase. This change in richness can be attributed to factors like ongoing succession, improving environmental conditions, and the emergence of new species that are well adapted to the evolving landscape. As the park approaches its climax community, we project that species richness will stabilize further, and this is because a maturing ecosystem develops resilience to disturbances, enabling it to recover more effectively and maintain stability through gradual changes in species composition rather than sudden shifts.
After analyzing the various data collected from 2003 to 2024 in Point Pleasant Park, there are multiple conclusions that can be drawn regarding the richness, diversity, and dominance of the park after Hurricane Juan. Firstly, in regards to the overall effects of Hurricane Juan on the diversity of the forest, this fact was analyzed using the Shannon Diversity Index in relation from 2003 to 2024. Generally, the diversity of the forest increased after the 2003 hurricane. From 2010 to 2019, the Shannon diversity primarily lied between the 1.5 to 2 range. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, however, there was a slight decrease in diversity. The ranges from 2020 to 2024 were most prevalent in the 1 to 1.5 category. When looking at overall richness of the forest, the richness of the forest was collected annually from 2002 to 2024, excluding 2005, 2007, and 2016 due to hurricanes, as well as 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, the richness of the forest has increased since the initial hurricane in 2003. The peak of the park's richness appears to have been in 2017, with a total of 14 separate species in the park. This trend is explained by the fact that ecological succession leads to an eventual stabilization in species richness. For at least 2 decades pre-hurricane, red spruce seems to have been the dominant tree species within Point Pleasant Park. As early as 2009, red maple has taken over as the dominant species. While the models resulting from our regression analysis are not strong enough to support predictions of future dominant species, there is a clear trend of increasing density of both species. Other studies have suggested that the climax community state of trees within Point Pleasant Park has been one that is dominated by red spruce, and that the current species composition seems to suggest this will be the case in the future. This presentation is dedicated to Dr. Alison Schmidt and Kaylin Collins, as well as the resources obtained from Dalhousie University. We also wanted to thank all lab groups in Biology 2060 for aiding in the coalition of data used within this presentation.